I'm Steve Turcotte, and I want to begin in a quiet chamber where power is slipping away. Candlelit trembles against cold stone. The air carries the smell of wax, damp wool, and old incense that soaked into the walls over decades. A king lies dying, and around him men measure the future in breaths, listening, watching, waiting for the smallest sign that the moment has finally arrived. Outside these walls, the sea is still winter dark, but it won't stay quiet for long. Edward the Confessor did not leave England with the clean certainty that later generations like to imagine. He left it with questions, not the kind that can be answered by a single signature or a single promise. These were questions built into the way England worked, into the way kingship worked. Because in Edward's England, the crown wasn't simply a family heirloom you passed from father to son like a ring. Blood mattered, yes, but so did recognition.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son,
so did
and
the
of the Holy
hard,
Spirit.
practical reality of whether
May
the
the Lord
leading men
grant
of
you
the
peace.
realm would stand with you when the weather turned, when the harvest failed, when word came that foreign sails had been seen on the horizon. In that room, the silence is not just grief, it's calculation. The men gathered there, bishops, earls,
Audimus
household
Domine.
officers, are not villains
Dona
and they're not
nobis pacem.
saints. They're human beings who understand that a kingdom can unravel faster than anyone thinks. One day of hesitation can become a week of rumor. A week of rumor can become an army in motion. The Witan, England's council of great men and churchmen, mattered. It mattered because it was one of the few institutions strong enough to give a decision the shape of legitimacy. A king could claim God's favor, but he still needed powerful hands to hold the realm together. And in a world like this, legitimacy isn't just an idea, it's a tool. It's the difference between an orderly succession and a civil war.
They are late. I
Oaths
hope the
mattered
news is
too.
favorable.
At
Given
least
the
they mattered the way
circumstances, I doubt
oaths
it.
often matter in
Prepare
medieval
yourself.
politics. They could be sacred, they could be sincere, and they could also be used like a blade, sharpened after the fact and held to someone's throat when it became useful. People swore promises on relics, on rings, on the memory of saints. But once a promise entered the public world, it could be interpreted, argued over, and reshaped, especially by men who wanted something. That's what makes this moment so tense. Edward's death is not only a personal tragedy, it's a political opening. And openings attract ambitious men the way blood attracts wolves. Edward
He is
himself
late.
had lived much of his early
Do you
life
think
in
the
exile.
king knows we are here?
He knew what it meant to be powerless.
We must remain
he
calm,
knew what
Sir
it meant
Richard.
to rely on foreign courts and foreign allies. That background shaped him, and it shaped his reign. It helped explain why Norman churchmen and advisors could find a place close to his authority. It also helps explain why some of the great English families, especially the Godwins, could feel both indispensable and threatened at the same time. England in the mid-11th century was not a collapsing backwater. It was wealthy by the standards of the age. It had functioning shires, taxes, courts, and a system of governance that could reach far beyond the king's personal presence. But a capable system can still fracture if the top becomes uncertain. If there is no obvious heir, even a strong kingdom can become brittle. Now imagine being one of those men in the chamber. You're watching the king fade. You can hear the fire pop and settle. You can hear someone shift their weight on the stone floor. And you can feel, in a way that's almost physical, the pull of what comes next. Who will the realm accept? Who can command loyalty not just in London, but in the north, in the west, along the coast, in the places where news travels slowly and anger travels fast? And maybe the hardest question of all, who can defend England if a rival decides to test this moment with ships and steel? This is where honor becomes complicated. We tend to treat honor as something pure, a kind of moral badge. But in a time like this, honor can also be a performance,
The line
a
must
public
continue
language
through
that
my son,
powerful men
Father.
use to make their decisions look
Do you
inevitable.
understand?
Some will mean every word they say. Others will speak of honor while thinking of survival. Most will do both, depending on the day. Edward's body is weakening, and that weakness spreads outward like ripples. It reaches the hall. It reaches the docks. It reaches the roads where messengers ride. It reaches the earls who command men, and the bishops who claim the authority of God. I want you to notice something here. The most dramatic battles often begin long before the first sword is drawn. They begin in rooms like this, lit by candles, where the future is shaped by quiet voices and careful glances. They begin in the pause between a king's last breath and the first public announcement that follows. Outside, the sea is waiting. Across the channel, rivals will be listening for any sign of weakness. In the north, other powers will be weighing their chances. England's strength is real, but strength without clarity can invite exactly the kind of crisis that can come.
I'm Steve Turco, and I want to begin in a quiet chamber where power is slipping away. Candlelight trembles against cold stone. The air smells of wax, damp wool, and incense that seeped into the walls over years. A king lies dying, and the men around him aren't speaking much. They're listening, not just to prayers, but to breathing, to the smallest change, because everyone in that room understands that the moment Edward the Confessor dies, England changes shape. Outside the palace precinct, winter hangs over the Thames like a gray curtain. The sea beyond is just as dark, just as patient. It feels distant from this bedside scene, but it isn't. In this world, the sea is never far from politics. It's a road, and roads carry men with claims. Edward did not leave England with the clean certainty that later generations like to imagine. He left questions behind. Some were personal, some were structural, built into how English kingship actually worked. In Edward's England, the crown wasn't simply a family possession that moved automatically from
He is
one
old
head
enough
to the
to
next.
understand the gravity
Blood
of his
mattered,
father's
yes,
actions.
but it wasn't
Indeed,
the only thing
the
that
Norman
mattered.
court watches
Recognition mattered. Support mattered. The hard, practical ability to hold the kingdom together mattered. Could a new king command loyalty in London and also in the Shires? Could he make the North obey, where distances are long and tempers can be short? Could he keep the peace when rival lords began to test each other? That is why the Witan matters here. This council of leading men and church figures isn't just decoration.
Let him watch.
It's one of the few
tapestry
forces in the
of power
kingdom
shifts
capable of giving a
regardless of his
decision
gaze.
the weight of legitimacy. People sometimes picture medieval rule as pure muscle and brute force, but governance is also consent, often reluctant consent, often negotiated. The Witan helps turn a power struggle into something that looks like an orderly transition. And then there are oaths. Medieval writers loved oaths. They loved the drama of them, the solemn vows, the sacred objects, the sense that a single promise could bind a man's soul. Sometimes it did. Sometimes an oath was genuinely feared. But oaths could also become weapons. Words spoken in one context could be
The
repeated
See of
later
Canterbury
with
must
different
defer
intent.
to the continent on
A
this
vow
matter,
could be
Father.
turned
Yes,
into a
Your
trap
Grace.
or a
Unity
justification
is paramount for
or
the
an
Church's
accusation.
strength.
That's one reason this room feels so tense. The silence isn't only grief, it's calculation. No one wants to be the man who waits too long. One day of hesitation can become a week of rumor. A week of rumor can become a local rebellion. And the local rebellion can invite a foreign landing. The men near Edward's bed, bishops, earls, stewards, guards, aren't angels or monsters. They're human. They understand what happens when a succession goes wrong, because they've seen it in other kingdoms. They know that if England looks uncertain, ambitious rivals won't treat that uncertainty as a tragedy. They'll treat it as an opportunity. Edward's own life made this problem sharper. He had spent years in exile and had been shaped by the world across the channel. That gave him strong ties to Norman churchmen and advisors.
It also made some powerful English families wary, especially the Godwins, whose influence had grown to the point where they could not be ignored. When you have a king with few clear heirs and noble families strong enough to challenge royal decisions, you have a kingdom that can function well right until the moment it doesn't. And England in the mid-11th century did function. This isn't the story of a broken realm waiting to be rescued. England was wealthy, organized, and capable. It had a system of local administration. It could raise troops. It could collect taxes. But even a well-built structure can crack if you remove the keystone at the top. That brings me back to the question people like to ask about honor. We like to treat honor as something pure, like a polished shield hung on a wall. But honor in medieval politics is usually messier than that. It's part belief, part reputation, part survival. Men speak of honor because they mean it, and also because others need to hear it. Sometimes honor is what keeps a kingdom from tearing itself apart.
There is little hope.
Sometimes it's what men use to make their ambitions sound righteous.
We must prepare for the worst.
So, in this candlelit chamber, honor might mean keeping faith with a dying king's wishes. Or it might mean choosing the strongest leader to prevent chaos. Or it might mean moving quickly before someone else moves. All of those can be argued as honorable, and all of them can be argued as self-serving. This is how great conflicts begin. Not with a trumpet, not with a battle cry. Often they begin in rooms like this, where people whisper, where eyes dart, where hands tighten around rings and prayer beads. The most dramatic battles start long before the first sword is drawn. Outside, the sea is waiting. Across the channel, men are listening for weakness. In the north, other powers will be measuring their chances. And inside this chamber, with candle flames shivering against stone, you can feel history leaning forward, right before anyone can pretend the outcome was obvious. We start here, with a dying king and a kingdom holding its breath. Because what comes next will not be decided by fate alone. It will be decided by choices. And choices in this world have a habit of arriving with steel.
When Edward the Confessor dies, the room doesn't suddenly become louder. If anything, it becomes more careful. People speak in shorter phrases. They watch each other's faces. Because in a kingdom like 11th century England, a transition of power isn't only about grief. It's about speed, coordination, and making sure the next move looks lawful
we proceed as
before
agreed.
it looks forceful.
There is no other path.
Here's the first complication.
So be it.
Medieval writers do not agree on what Edward said at the end, or even how direct his final wishes were. Some accounts present a clear, almost simple handle. Others suggest something more cautious, more collective, less a royal command, and more a political decision made by the leading men of the realm. And that difference matters, because later generations would treat Edward's last days like evidence in a trial. What we can say with confidence is this: Harold Godwinson becomes king in a way that fits English political practice. The Witan's support gives him legitimacy inside the system England already had. This is not a random seizure in the night. It is a decision made quickly, and that speed itself tells you something. It suggests urgency. It suggests the leadership feared what might happen if the throne sat uncertain for too long.
Quickly, the crown. They are waiting.
But legitimacy at home does not guarantee acceptance abroad, and it doesn't silence every rival inside the kingdom either. England is wealthy and organized, but it's also exposed. Coasts are open. Sea lanes connect England to ambitious neighbors. A disputed succession is like a signal fire. It draws attention. Across the channel, William, Duke of Normandy, watches all of this with the focus of a man who has spent most of his life defending what he believed was his by right. And if you want to understand William's reaction to Harold's coronation, you have to understand William's upbringing. He wasn't raised in comfortable certainty. His early years as Duke were dangerous: rebellions, betrayals, threats that weren't rumors but real blades, real plots, real consequences. Normandy in William's youth was not a gentle place to learn politics. It was a place where power had to be held tightly, because the moment you looked weak, men tested you.
That kind of childhood doesn't produce the polished knight of later stories. It produces a ruler who is cautious with trust, quick to punish disloyalty, and deeply sensitive to questions of legitimacy. Because legitimacy is not an abstract idea to a man like William. It's the difference between surviving and being replaced. So William's claim to the English throne becomes central, at least in his own narrative. Norman sources later emphasize that Edward had named William as heir at some point. It's possible. Edward had deep ties to Normandy. He had spent years in exile. He relied on Norman churchmen and advisors during his reign. So the idea of some promise, some indication, is not impossible.
The scouts report
But
the
here's
northern
where the
passes are
historian
open,
in
my
me
duke.
slows down.
Prepare the
Even
cavalry.
if Edward spoke
We move at
favorably of
dawn.
William, English kingship wasn't simply a private inheritance. The Witan mattered, the great earls mattered, the church mattered.
We must
The king's
secure the
personal
northern border
preference
before
could
winter.
influence the
Welsh
future,
marches
but it
are
did not
restless, my
automatically
lord.
determine it.
The defensible lines
England
are
was
here.
not Normandy, and William knew that. That's why he needed more than a claim. He needed a moral case, something that could turn an invasion into a kind of righteous correction. That brings us to the most controversial thread in the whole story. Harold Godwinson's alleged oath to William. In Norman accounts, Harold is said to have sworn to support William's claim. Some versions include dramatic details, holy relics, solemn vows, an oath that feels almost impossible to escape. English sources don't confirm the story in the same way, and later historians still debate what Harold actually promised, what he understood, and whether he was under pressure when any oath was taken. And I want you to sit with that uncertainty for a second, because it's the kind of uncertainty medieval history is full of. It's not that nothing happened. It's that the surviving versions of what happened were written by people with stakes in the outcome. If Harold swore an oath freely, then William looks like a wronged man seeking justice. If Harold's words were coerced, manipulated, or later exaggerated, then the moral balance shifts. Either way, the oath becomes powerful, not because it's perfectly documented, but because it can be used.
Let them come!
This is the part that always pulls me back to the question of honor. We talk about honor as though it's a clean rulebook, but in medieval politics, honor is often a language spoken by armed men. It can be sincere, absolutely. Men really did fear spiritual consequences. Men really did shape their identities around keeping their word. But honor can also be deployed, like a banner raised at the right moment, like a story told to make violence look necessary. For William, the oath story, true, partial, or sharpened by later writers, served a purpose. It framed Harold not as a legitimate English king, but as a breaker of faith. And that mattered, because a duke preparing to cross the sea needed allies. He needed fighters who could convince themselves they were not just raiding, but enforcing a rightful order. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson sits on a throne that is real, but newly claimed. He has to hold the kingdom together in the face of multiple threats. He has to keep the great earls aligned. He has
This
to
is
keep
the
the church
objective.
on his side.
Move swiftly
He has to watch the
and
coast.
leave no enemy
and he has to do
untouched.
it knowing that the winds and tides are not under his control. This is what makes the opening phase of 1066 feel so tense. Not because everyone knows what will happen, but because no one can fully control what happens next. A disputed succession invites rival interpretations, and rival
hear that?
interpretations invite
The abbey
shifts.
bells are ringing.
So when you think about this moment,
do they mean?
don't picture it as a simple
Is it the
contest
king?
of rightful versus wrongful. Picture it as a collision of systems. England's elective, council-driven legitimacy against Normandy's dynastic and promise-driven legitimacy. And standing between them are human beings, proud, exhausted, ambitious, fearful, trying to
stand at
turn
the edge of
uncertainty
destiny.
into advantage
The path
before
is
someone else
righteousness,
does.
though blood must be
Because
shed.
in the end, the
I
strongest
understand.
claim is the one you can enforce.
If you step out of Edward the Confessor's sick room and follow the news across the channel, you arrive in a very different world. Normandy is not thinking about English custom or English councils. Normandy is
Men of
thinking
Normandy,
about claims,
our hour
promises,
has come.
rights, and whether a
For
man
Normandy.
can turn those words into something real.
William, Duke of Normandy, does not react to Harold Godwinson's coronation like someone hearing distant gossip. He reacts like someone hearing a personal challenge, because William's life has been shaped by instability from the start. He grew up in a duchy where rebellion wasn't theoretical and loyalty wasn't guaranteed. When you survive that kind of childhood, you don't become sentimental about power. You become careful with it. You become stubborn about legitimacy. You learn to treat uncertainty as an enemy. That's why William's claim to England matters so much in this story. Norman writers later emphasized that Edward had named William as his heir at some point, and it's not impossible. Edward had spent years in exile in Normandy. He had Norman ties. Norman clerics and advisors found a place near his court. There were bridges between the two
The decision
worlds.
is made.
But I have
Go!
to slow down here, because this is where medieval politics refuses to be neat. Even if Edward did express a preference, even if he spoke of William in a favorable way, English kingship was not simply a matter of private inheritance. It wasn't a locked chest where the king kept a single key. It was a public institution shaped by the wheat arm and by powerful earls who expected to be consulted. A king could guide the future, but he could not always dictate it. So, when Norman sources speak with certainty about Edward's promise, historians have to treat that certainty with caution. And then is the most controversial thread of all, the oath. In Norman accounts, Harold Godwinson is said to have sworn to support William's claim. Some versions add unforgettable details, sacred relics hidden under cloth, the shock of discovering what you've sworn upon, the weight of a promise made in a foreign land. It's a dramatic story, and it's powerful. But English sources do
This
not
clause
confirm it
specifically
in the
revows
same
the
way,
earlier grant.
and
He
modern
cannot deny his
historians
own
still
seal. Very
argue
well.
about what
We will
Harold
prepare
might
the
have
updated
sworn,
writ based
what
on
he
this.
understood, and whether he was under pressure at the time. Harold may have been shipwrecked. He may have been effectively detained. He may have made commitments that seemed reasonable in the moment and impossible later. Or parts of the story may have been sharpened
The contribution
after the
to the
conquest,
cathedral must be
because a
settled before
conqueror
the new
always
tax.
needs more than
I will
victory.
see to it.
He needs justification. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It's the story. Because whether the oath was absolute, partial, coerced, or later exaggerated, it became a political weapon. William could present himself not merely as a rival claimant, but as the wrong party, a man deprived of what had been promised, a man seeking justice rather than conquest. And that matters, because legitimacy was not just a moral concept in the 11th century. It was recruitment, it was diplomacy, it was how you convinced allies, especially churchmen and nobles, that this war had a righteous shape. This is where I always come back to the question of honor. We like to treat honor as something clear, like a rule carved in stone. But medieval honor is often spoken aloud while it's being negotiated. It can be sincere, deeply sincere. Men really did fear spiritual consequences. They really did believe that oaths could bind the soul. But honor can also be used like a cloak, worn when it protects you, dropped when it gets in your way. Sometimes honor is faith, sometimes it is strategy, and very often it is both at once. While William builds his case, he also begins turning words into timber and rope. You can almost picture it, a Norman
I will
hall
not
lit
yield
by
more territory.
firelight, parchments
Then
on a
prepare for
table,
war.
seals pressed into wax. Then, outside, the shipyards, the steady hammering of planks, the smell of tar, the creak of rope under strain, the slow stacking of barrels and weapons. War doesn't begin with the landing, it begins with preparation. Meanwhile, across the water, Harold Godwinson is facing a different kind of pressure. He is king now, and he has to defend a coastline that cannot be guarded everywhere at once. England's feared system could raise men quickly, but it could not keep them mobilized forever. Farmers still had fields. Time still mattered. A long summer of waiting could quietly weaken a kingdom more than a brief battle. And that's the part people forget.
Scouts
The
report
most
the flank is
dangerous
exposed.
enemy isn't
We shall
always the one
reinforce
you
it.
can see.
Our claim is
Sometimes it's
secure.
the calendar. Sometimes it's hunger. Sometimes it's the slow erosion of readiness. So, on one side of the channel, you have William preparing an invasion, shaping his claim into a moral argument and a logistical machine. On the other side, you have Harold Godwinson trying to hold the realm together, knowing that waiting too long can collapse his resources, but moving too soon can leave a gap for an enemy. This is the tension at the heart of the succession crisis. It's not simply a question of who is right. It's a question of which version of legitimacy can survive contact with reality. England says legitimacy comes through the Witan, through the leading men of the realm acknowledging a king who can rule. Normandy says legitimacy can come through a promise, through a designated heir, through a sworn oath. Both positions can be defended, depending on which sources you trust and which political system you assume is the normal one.
As you command.
And the men involved, William, Harold, the bishops, the earls, aren't abstract symbols. They're people who make decisions under pressure. They worry about reputation. They worry about survival. They worry about what their children will inherit if they lose. So, as we move forward, keep this.
When I read the medieval sources around 1066, I'm always struck by how quickly a political argument becomes a moral one. William of Normandy didn't just say, "I want England." He framed the succession as a question of legitimacy, broken faith, and rightful order. And that framing mattered because legitimacy in the 11th century wasn't an academic debate. It was a weapon you could carry into a council chamber, into a church, and eventually onto a battlefield. If you can
Then let it
convince
be
enough
so.
people that you're not
Mobilize.
invading but correcting a wrong, you attract allies, you attract resources. You attract the kind of support that doesn't come easily to a man
the
who
winter breaks
admits
early,
he's
we are
simply
exposed.
gambling for power.
It is the shortest route
And
to the
that's
castle.
where the idea of
We must hold
honor
the line
gets
here.
complicated. We tend to imagine medieval honor as a simple code, like a straight road that always leads to the same destination. But honor in medieval politics is often more like a language, spoken loudly when it helps, spoken carefully when it doesn't. It can be sincere. It can also be strategic. And in a moment like this, it's usually both at the same time.
Light the beacon!
An oath, if it happened the way Norman writers later described it, becomes a moral chain around Harold Godwinson's neck. If the oath was coerced, or misunderstood, or later exaggerated, it still functions the same way in the propaganda war. That's the part that's uncomfortable, but important. Even uncertainty can be useful if you're skilled enough to shape it into a story. And William was skilled. In Normandy, a claim didn't live only in words. It lived in wax seals and parchment, in envoys riding hard along muddy roads, in bishops who could give a cause the scent of righteousness, in shipyards that turned timber into hulls and rope into rigging, in a duke's ability to make preparation look like duty. You can almost picture it if you slow down and let it feel real. A Norman hall lit by firelight, a table scattered with letters and maps, men leaning
The evidence
close
is
so their
clear.
voices don't carry.
The seal confirms our
Outside,
right.
the scrape
William,
of tools,
the claim
and the
is
steady
undeniable.
rhythm of work,
Let it be so.
the smell of tar, the creak of a mast being raised, the ordinary labor that makes extraordinary violence possible. That's what a lot of people miss about medieval war. It isn't only courage, it's organization, it's supply, it's timing. The most decisive moments can be measured in barrels of grain and the direction of the wind. And across the channel, Harold Godwinson is dealing with a different kind of reality.
One that doesn't care what a
saw him
Norman
ride towards the
chronicle
South
says
Ridge right after
and
the
doesn't
robbery.
pause to admire
He's armed
anyone's
and
claims.
dangerous.
Harold is king now, and he has to defend England's southern coast. That sounds simple until you remember what the coastline actually is. Long, exposed, irregular, full of potential landing points. England is not a fortress. It's a country
must
with
take the
open
castle.
doors.
I agree.
So Harold does what
I
a
agree.
responsible ruler does.
Gather the levies.
He watches the horizon. He gathers men. He prepares for a landing he knows is coming. But even this preparation has a clock attached to it. England's military system could raise men quickly through local obligation, but it wasn't designed to keep large forces standing in the field for months on end. Men had farms. Harvests mattered. Families mattered. An army that waits too long starts to dissolve, not because it's cowardly, but because it's human. Food runs down. Patience runs down. And every day a man stands on a windy headland staring at empty water is a day he's not working the land that keeps him alive. This is where strategy becomes brutally practical. You can't just hold the coast forever, not at full strength, not without paying a price that might be worse than the invasion itself. And the longer Harold holds his army in readiness, the more he risks weakening his own kingdom from the inside. A hungry countryside is a dangerous countryside. A tired nobility is a dangerous nobility. A kingdom can be
47,
stable and
48,
still become
49,
brittle under
50.
strain.
And that makes...
So Harold is trapped between two fears. If he waits too long, his defenses soften and his men drift away. If he stands down too early and the Normans land the next morning, he might have to fight before he can gather his strength again. That's not a heroic dilemma. It's an administrative one. It's the kind of decision that doesn't look impressive in art, but decides lives. And then there's the sea itself. The Norman plans depended on ships, and ships depend on wind. Medieval chroniclers love to describe destiny and divine will, but sometimes what they're really describing is wind. A fleet can be ready and still sit idle, because nature isn't impressed by ambition. For William, delays could be dangerous. An army eats. An army complains.
Hold it there.
Men who signed on
That is
for
as
quick
far
glory
as we
don't
can
always
push the
enjoy
line.
sitting in damp camps while supplies shrink. Even disciplined forces develop friction when nothing happens for too long. That's why you see this strange mirror in the summer of 1066. Harold is trying to keep an army together without exhausting it. William is trying to keep an invasion force ready without letting it rot in place. Both men are wrestling with the same truth. War is a test of endurance before it is a test of strength. So when we talk about honor in this moment, I think it's worth asking a quieter question. What does honor mean to the men who aren't kings? To the farmer
terms are
called
clear,
up
my
to
lord.
hold a shield
The crown
at the
demands
coast,
it,
watching
and
for
then it is
sails
done.
that never come. To the sailor in Normandy hauling rope for a duke's dream, wondering if the dream will pay him back. To the local lord expected to provide men and food, while calculating what happens if the wrong side wins.
Through the summer of 1066, Harold Godwinson holds the South like a man trying to keep a door shut with his shoulder. He stations men along the coast. He gathers ships where he can. He keeps watch on the water, day after day, because he knows what everyone in England knows. If William of Normandy lands with an army, the fight won't be a debate about law. It will be a test of steel and of how fast Harold can concentrate force at the right point. But the sea doesn't cooperate with human plans. For weeks, the wind and the weather work against the Normans. The invasion that everyone expects doesn't arrive. And that delay is not a gift. Not really. It's a kind of slow poison. Because an army is not a statue. You can't keep thousands of men standing in readiness forever. England's system can mobilize quickly,
but it has limits. Men have farms, they have harvests, they have families who need them. Every extra week on coastal duty means another week of drained patience, drained supplies, and drained goodwill. The longer Harold holds his forces in place, the more his own strength starts to fray at the edges. This is the part of medieval war that rarely makes it into heroic storytelling.
The time has
Everyone
come.
remembers the
map is
battles and
sealed.
the clash. Hardly anyone remembers the hunger, the damp clothes, the endless waiting, and the quiet resentment that grows when men feel their lives being spent without a battle to justify it. War is logistics before it is glory. It's bread and salted meat, it's water barrels, it's horses that need fodder, it's ships that need repairs. It's the simple truth that you can't keep a kingdom on pause while you wait for an enemy to make the first move. So Harold has to make decisions that are almost impossible to make perfectly. Keep the army together and risk exhausting the country, or stand men down and risk being caught unprepared. Neither option feels safe. Both options carry a price. And while Harold watches the channel, something else is happening. Far to the north, another claimant is looking at England's succession crisis and seeing not a tragedy, but an opening. Harold Sigurdsson, Hardrada, is not a wandering raider from the margins of Europe. He is a king with an international career and a reputation that stretches across the map. He has fought in Scandinavia.
We must consider the
He
moral
has served
implications,
abroad.
brother.
He has
God is on
learned
our side,
statecraft
provided
in
our
places
actions
where
are
power
just.
is
Indeed.
complicated
We
and
strike at
ruthless.
dawn.
He is exactly the kind of man who understands that a moment of uncertainty is the best time to strike. Even hostile writers acknowledge his weight. One of the harshest portraits comes from Adam of Bremen, who describes Harold as violent, relentless, and cruel toward the church. Adam is writing as a Christian chronicler, and he is not neutral. He has his own moral and political lenses, so we have to read him carefully. But here's the thing. Bias doesn't mean fiction. It means selection. It means emphasis. A hostile source can still preserve real impressions, and the impression Adam gives us is clear enough. Harold's rule in Norway was hard. He was feared. He was effective. And he did not have the temperament of a man who spends his final years quietly guarding what he already owns. I want you to feel the geometry of this moment. England is looking south, bracing for Normandy. Normandy is looking west, waiting on wind. And Norway is looking toward England as a ripe target, because the kingdom has a new king, divided loyalties, and a coastline that cannot be everywhere at once. This is why 1066 is so dangerous. It isn't one threat, it's multiple threats converging, each one making the others worse. And behind the names and titles, there's a human reality I don't think we should ignore. Harold Hardrada is not young. He is a seasoned man at the height of his power. He has wealth, ships, and reputation, but he also knows time is not infinite. Kings in this era do not retire. They do not step aside gracefully. Their reigns end when their bodies fail or when someone kills them. If Harold wants a final defining conquest, something worthy of his legend, England is the biggest prize still on the table. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson is in a different position. He is newly crowned, and he must prove himself immediately. His kingship is legitimate by English custom, but legitimacy has to be reinforced by success. If he fails to defend the realm, every rival will treat that failure as proof that he never deserved the crown. So the pressure on Harold is constant. Not just military pressure, but political pressure. Every choice can be framed by enemies as weakness. Every delay can be framed as incompetence, and every hardship his men endure can become resentment that someone else might exploit. This is where the idea of honor becomes real and dangerous.
Wait.
Because
What
yes,
is it?
Harold needs
Listen.
to do what is honorable,
The wind has shifted.
defend his people, uphold the realm, keep faith with the office he has accepted. But honor doesn't feed an army. Honor doesn't keep men from drifting back to their farms when the season demands it. Honor doesn't change the wind. And on the other side, Harold Hardrada can wrap his ambitions in the language of right and inheritance and vengeance, but underneath is the same ancient engine, opportunity. The belief that if you strike at the right time, the world will have to accept what you take. When you strip away the speeches and the saga poetry, you're left with two men on different coasts, both wrestling with the same truth. Power is never secure. It has to be maintained, it has to be demonstrated, and sometimes it has to be gambled. So as summer turns and the waiting becomes unbearable, England is
Jarls are
already
restless.
paying for a war
What
that
is your
hasn't
decision,
fully
my king?
arrived. And in
Take
the
the
north,
north.
another war
Show them
is
the might of
quietly
Norway.
taking shape. One that Harold
If you want to understand why Harold Sigurdsson, Harold Hardrada, would ever gamble for the throne of England, you have to stop thinking of him as a man who simply appeared in the North Sea in the year 1066. He didn't. He was built over decades, by defeat, by exile, by foreign gold, by court intrigue, by the kind of war that doesn't leave you innocent, even if you survive it. Harold was born in Norway in 1015, into a world where kingship was never safe and never truly private.
Your father
It was
would
public.
expect strength
It
here,
was
Harold.
contested.
Do not
It was
let ambition
something that
blind
had to
you
be
to the threats
defended
gathering in the
constantly,
east.
not
We must
only
be
against
ready.
enemies, but against rivals inside your own culture who believed strength was the only proof that mattered. By the time
The tide
Harold was
serves
old
us
enough
now.
to carry a
We
weapon,
must strike
Norway
before the
was
mist
tangled
clears.
in a larger
Agreed.
struggle for
Prepare the
power
fleet.
in the North Sea world. His half-brother was Olaf Haraldsson, the king later remembered as Saint Olaf, who tried to solidify his rule and drive Christian conversion with a force that created loyal supporters and bitter enemies at the same time. That combination is important. It tells you the political temperature Harold grew up in. This wasn't a gentle era of tidy succession.
Tally 7,
It was an
90 men.
era where
Tally
faith,
8,
law,
102.
violence, and legitimacy
This
were
cannot be
fused
right.
together.
We are running low.
In 1030, that tension exploded at Stiklestad. This is the battlefield where Olaf was killed and where Harold, still a teenager, fought and survived. The broad facts are firm. The battle happened, Olaf died, Harold escaped, wounded. The sagas later give us details, formations, speeches, heroic moments that are difficult to confirm precisely because they were written down long after the event. But the outcome is clear enough, and it matters more than any single dramatic scene. Harold's first major experience of war ends in defeat and flight. I don't think we talk enough about what that does to a person. Defeat can break you, but it can also sharpen you. It teaches you that courage isn't always rewarded, that loyalty doesn't always save you, that fate is not a romantic idea, it's a force that can kick your legs out from under you without warning. After Stiklestad, Harold doesn't return to a peaceful life and reflect quietly. He has to run. He has to disappear into forests and safe houses. And
We saw
whether
the
or
tracks
not
near the
every
eastern
detail
woods.
in the later
They are getting
stories is
bolder.
literal,
We cannot
the
let them
truth
take the
behind
livestock
them
again.
feels
We must
historically
set a watch
plausible.
tonight.
A young man of royal blood suddenly dependent on secrecy and on the mercy of ordinary people. That kind of experience can
warriors.
make a man
By the
humble.
light of this
More
fire,
often,
we
it
swear
makes
our
him
oath.
dangerous
Blood will be
because the
spilled,
lesson is
and
simple.
victory will be
If you
ours.
ever regain power, you will not be caught unprepared again. From there, Harold goes east into the world of the Kievan Rus. That might sound like an exotic detour if you picture medieval Europe as disconnected, but it wasn't. Scandinavians traveled those river routes for trade, for raiding, and for mercenary service. The East wasn't a myth to them, it was a network. In Kiev, Harold enters the orbit of Yaroslav the Wise, and again, the sources don't always give us perfect clarity on each campaign, each battle, each appointment. Medieval records rarely do, but the larger reality is well-grounded. Scandinavian warriors served Eastern rulers, and those rulers valued experienced military leadership. Harold's career becomes professional. He learns to command under a different kind of authority, more layered, more administrative, more deeply political than the hall politics of Norway. Then the road pulls him even farther south, toward the richest prize a northern warrior could imagine, Constantinople. To Norse speakers, it was Miklagard, the great city, a place of walls so vast they seemed unreal, of markets full of languages you couldn't name, of an empire that still carried Roman prestige even as it struggled through its own crises. Harold joins the Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite foreign troops, many of them Scandinavian. That much is broadly accepted, and you can feel what that must have meant, not just wealth, but proximity to the machinery of imperial power. Harold is no longer only a fighter. He's a man in systems, inside pay scales, command structures, palace routines, and politics sharp enough to cut through armor. The sagas tell dramatic stories about his years in Byzantium, campaigns, intrigue, imprisonment, even involvement in the fall of Emperor Michael V in 1042. We know that emperor was overthrown and blinded after intense unrest in Constantinople. What's harder to prove is Harold's exact role in those events, because Byzantine sources don't always put him at the center the way the Norse tradition later does. That doesn't mean Harold wasn't there. It means we should be careful. Medieval storytelling often pulls famous men into famous scenes because it makes a better narrative. But here's what I think we can say with confidence. Harold saw enough of imperial politics to learn a rule that never stops being true. Power does not reward loyalty consistently. It rewards advantage. It rewards timing. It rewards the ability to act while others hesitate. So, if you've lived through that, if you've been wounded in a lost cause, sheltered in forests, promoted in foreign courts, and forced to navigate imperial rivalries, your understanding of honor changes. Honor stops being a simple moral ornament. It becomes something you weigh against survival, against opportunity, against the brutal truth that if you lose, the world won't admire your principles. It will replace you. So, by the time Harold turns his mind back to the north, he's not just the brother of a fallen king. He's a seasoned commander. When Harald Hardrada finally turns his face back towards Scandinavia, it isn't a homecoming scene from a legend. It's a political landing. He comes north in the mid-11th century with something most rivals don't have all at once: money earned abroad, followers who've campaigned with him, and a reputation sharpened by years in foreign service. In Norway, that combination isn't just impressive, it's dangerous, because it means he doesn't have to ask politely for a place in the future. He can take one. By this time, Norway is ruled by his nephew, Magnus the Good, the son of Harald's half-brother Olaf. Magnus has inherited a kingdom that's still learning what stable monarchy even looks like. He's young, capable, and already tested. And then Harald arrives, older, richer, hardened, carrying the quiet confidence of a man who has stood inside the machinery of larger empires. What happens next is one of those compromises that looks tidy on paper and tense in real life. A settlement is reached in the mid-40s. Harald and Magnus agree to share rule in Norway. It's not hard to see why. Magnus avoids a civil war. Harald gains legitimacy without having to burn the country to claim it. But shared kingship is rarely comfortable.
Your prince
It
demands
doesn't
much,
remove
but
ambition,
we offer
it
strength in
only
return.
postpones its
The pension
collision.
eggs will not wait forever.
You can
and
imagine
my
the
swords are
atmosphere in
sworn
the
to.
halls. 2 royal courts, 2 circles of advisors, 2 sets of loyalties. Every decision becomes a test of who truly leads. Every feast becomes a display of rank. Every silence becomes political. And then, in 1047, Magnus dies. He leaves no heir of his own. That changes everything. Harald becomes sole king of Norway, and he steps into full control with the momentum of a man who has been waiting years to stop sharing. This is where the nickname Hard Ruler starts to feel less like a flourish and more like a summary. Because ruling Norway isn't just leading warriors, it's collecting taxes, managing nobles, forcing obedience in regions that have long enjoyed autonomy. It's deciding when to punish and when to bargain. It's making the state more real than any single family's pride. But Harald doesn't settle into peace. He turns immediately toward Denmark. For years, he fights Sweyn Estridsson, a rival king with his own base of support and his own legitimacy claims. Harald wins battles. He devastates coasts. He shows again and again that he can strike hard. But Denmark does not fold. The war becomes long, expensive, and exhausting. This isn't the romantic war of a single decisive duel between kings. It's the grinding kind. Ships, raids, rebuilt towns, more ships, more raids. Even when Harald wins, he doesn't get the clean outcome he wants. And eventually, by 1064, there is peace. Not because the two men become friends, not because honor suddenly triumphs over ambition. Peace comes because war has costs, and both realms are feeling them. Farmers tire of funding campaigns that don't deliver lasting security. Nobles begin to calculate what the king's obsession is doing to their own power. The state's strength is not infinite. Even a hard ruler has to listen when the ground beneath him starts to shift. So, Harald changes direction. He stops trying to force Denmark into his grasp, and he looks west, England. His claim is rooted in an older web of agreements, claims that passed through Magnus and were tied to an understanding made with Hardrada, who ruled England and Denmark and died without children in the early 40s. The idea, simplified, is that one king died without an heir, the other would inherit.
Get back, quickly!
That kind of pact sounds straightforward, but it rarely is. Medieval claims are almost never universally accepted. They're tools, not laws of nature. Still, a claim like this gives Harald something useful, a legal-sounding reason to pursue what he wants. And that's important, because great wars often need a story that can be told out loud.
The levies are exhausted.
Then, in 1066, England's own crisis erupts. Edward the Confessor dies. Harold Godwinson takes the throne. William of Normandy prepares his own invasion. England is bracing for a southern storm. And into that moment steps Tostig Godwinson. Tostig is Harold's brother, and he is angry, exiled, and desperate. He can't return to power by himself. He needs a stronger arm. So he goes north and offers Harald something that matters almost as much as ships: a doorway into English politics, local knowledge, contacts, a claim that can be framed as a restoration, not just conquest. But let's be honest about what this alliance is. It's not a tale of loyalty. It's two men using each other.
Pay the levies again
Tostig
this year.
Needs an army.
The tallies
Harald
do not lie.
needs an
There is
excuse
nothing
and a
left
guide.
after the war.
Each imagines he can control the other once the prize is closer. This is one of those moments where the distance between honor and ambition becomes very small. Both men can speak the language of rightful claims. Both can present themselves as correcting an injustice, but underneath, the decision is brutally practical. England looks vulnerable. The time is now. And Harald does what seasoned rulers do when they see a window open. He moves fast. He begins calling up men. He gathers ships. He prepares not as a raider who hopes for loot, but as a king who intends to reshape the kingdom. When you reach this point in the story, you can feel how 1066 becomes more than a single invasion. It becomes a convergence. Normandy waiting in the south, Norway moving in the north, England caught between them, trying to hold its legitimacy together while the sea delivers competitors to its shore. And I think this is the most human detail of all. None of these men can truly know how the year will end. They can plan,
They can pray, they can threaten and bargain.
I
By
ask only
late
for what
summer
is
of
mine by right, Harold.
1066,
Do not
Harold
deny me
Hardrada's
justice.
fleet is no
Justice
longer
here
a
is
rumor
forged in-
moving along the trade routes. It's a living thing on the North Sea. Dark holes, shields along the rails, sails pulling hard against the wind. When those ships finally reach the English coast, the landing is efficient and unapologetic.
We sail
Long
within the
ships
hour.
slide
Get
onto
those
shingle
provisions
and mud
loaded
with
now.
the scrape of
Ready
timber
the
and
oarsmen.
stone. Men step down into cold surf. Some laugh, some don't. There's no ceremony, no speech for the locals. Just the quick, practiced movements of veterans unloading gear, setting watch, and turning a beach into a foothold. From there, the Norwegians push inland toward York, and you can feel the geography doing its work. Roads funnel movement, rivers cut the land into choices. Villages
Men,
become
put your
supply
backs into
points
it.
or
To the
obstacles,
sea.
depending on who arrives first. The northern English earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, do what they can to meet the threat. They gather men, they choose ground they believe can help them, and on the 20th of September, they confront Hardrada's army at Fulford, just south of York. Fulford is not a neat storybook battle. It's a fight in difficult terrain, marshy ground, a nearby river, and men trying to hold lines where the land itself wants to pull them apart. Shield walls meet with that heavy, ugly sound of wood and iron colliding. Spears jab in tight spaces. Boots sink and slip. Bodies fall into mud and reeds and don't get up. Hardrada's force wins. The English line breaks. It isn't because the Northumbrians are cowards. It's because the Norwegians are experienced, numerous, and led by a man who has spent his life in war. Edwin and Morcar escape, but their
we move them
defeat
south,
leaves York
the north is
exposed.
vulnerable.
And York, seeing what happens
We
to
cannot
towns
be
that
strong
resist too
everywhere at
long,
once, Harold.
surrenders. I always pause here because surrender is one of the most human acts in war. It's not glory, it's fear and calculation. It's city leaders looking at walls and granaries and the faces of their own people and deciding that survival is worth humiliation. The Norwegians take hostages and supplies. They enter the city. The streets become quiet in that particular way they get when armed men arrive who don't belong there. Then Hardrada does something that seems reasonable to him and fatal in hindsight. He goes to Stamford Bridge to receive hostages, expecting the next step to be administration, order, control, the slow work of turning conquest into routine. The day is warm, bright for late September. Many Norwegians leave their armor behind, not because they are stupid, but because they are tired, because they believe the worst is over, because victory can make even seasoned fighters relax. And that is when Harold Godwinson arrives. The speed of Harold's march north is still startling. It's one of the great logistical feats of the year. He has just spent months watching the southern coast for William of Normandy, and now he's forced to race to the opposite end of the kingdom to face a second invasion, one he cannot ignore without losing the north entirely. If you've ever wondered how a king can lose a war even after winning a battle, this is how. Not with a single mistake, but with exhaustion, with the limits of the human body, with the simple fact that an army that marches hard cannot
Together
fight
now,
forever
move it to
at
the
full
sand.
strength. At Stamford Bridge, the English attack catches the Norwegians off guard.
The enemy is
Confusion turns
positioned
into
on the North
urgent
Ridge,
movement.
ready to
Men
march.
sprint for helmets and mail.
Understood.
Hands fumble with straps
the
that
men.
suddenly feel too tight. Lines form quickly, but not neatly. Later tradition tells of a single Norwegian warrior holding the bridge, cutting down attackers until he is killed from below by a spear thrust up through the planks. It's the kind of episode the sagas love. Simple, vivid, unforgettable. Historians debate it because details like this are hard to confirm. But even if the story has been polished, the reality behind it is plausible enough. A narrow crossing can be held briefly by a determined fighter, and briefly can matter. The bridge is forced, and the battle spreads into the fields. What follows is not a duel between kings. It's a killing ground, close combat, shields shoved into faces, spears thrust into gaps, men slipping in blood and trampled grass, the air thick with dust and sweat, and that sharp metallic smell that rises when iron is struck
We are
again and
emissaries
again.
from the Earl.
Hardrada
seek terms
fights
of
in the
surrender.
thick of it,
You may
and then
approach no
in the
closer.
chaos, he is
State
struck
your
by an
terms
arrow
from
in the
there.
throat and dies. A king's death on a battlefield is never just personal. It's a rupture. It shakes morale. It breaks cohesion. It turns plans into improvisation. The Norwegian army, leaderless in the moment that matters most, begins to give ground. Many die.
close to the
Some
fire.
escape. The invasion that looked unstoppable only days earlier collapses into retreat. And now the wind shifts again, because England does not get to rest. Harold Godwinson has won in the north, but
This sun
victory has
feels good on
cost
the
him
skin.
time, men,
It is a
and
fine
strength.
day for
His
England.
army is exhausted. His best fighters have marched hard and fought harder, and now he has to turn south because William of Normandy has been waiting for exactly this moment, the moment when the English king is far away and then desperately tired.
Keep pace, lads.
Within days, Harold begins to march down the length of England. You can almost see it. Blistered feet, cracked lips, shoulders bruised from shield straps, men forcing themselves forward because they know what happens if they hesitate. And this is where part 9 ends, on a truth that feels almost cruel. The battle that saves England from one invader helps make it vulnerable to the next. Stamford Bridge is a triumph. It is also a drain. If you want to understand 1066, don't think of it as one story. Think of it as two storms arriving from opposite directions, and one exhausted kingdom caught in the middle, trying to stand upright while history leans into it with full weight.
Hold the line.
After Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson doesn't get the kind of pause that a victory should earn. There's no long celebration, no time to let the dead be counted properly, no chance to let the men recover their strength. The battlefield is still warm with breath and dust, and already the next problem is pressing in from the south. Harold has just saved his kingdom from one invasion, but he's done it at a terrible price. Time, fatigue, and the slow wearing down of his best soldiers. His army has marched hard, fought hard, and now, almost immediately, it has to march again. If you've ever tried to imagine what a medieval army actually feels like, think of the body before you think of the banner. Think of swollen feet inside wet boots. Think of shoulders bruised raw from shield straps. Think of hunger and the stiffness that follows a day of fighting. Victory doesn't erase any of that. Sometimes victory just makes you carry it farther. So Harold turns south. England is long. Roads are rough, messages are uncertain, and every mile he travels away from York is a mile that has to be paid for in breath and will. The men in his column keep going because they understand what's at stake, but understanding doesn't make it easier, it just makes it necessary. And while Harold's army is dragging itself back toward the Channel, William of Normandy is finally moving. The sea that refused him earlier in the year now gives him the opening he needs. In late September, William lands on the south coast at Pevensey. He doesn't come ashore like a raider looking for quick loot. He comes ashore like a ruler who intends to stay. He fortifies, he organizes, he secures supplies, he builds a base that can survive an English counterattack. This is where conquest stops being a dramatic moment and becomes a system. William's first steps are not heroic gestures, they are practical ones. He establishes control over terrain. He makes sure his men can eat. He makes sure his ships can be protected. He makes sure he can receive reinforcements and news. And Harold, still marching, has to decide what kind of war he can afford. The longer he waits, the stronger William's position becomes. But the faster he moves, the weaker his own army may be when the battle finally comes. This is one of the cruel truths of leadership in war. A king doesn't get to choose the perfect moment. He chooses between bad options, then lives with the consequences. Harold reaches the south with an exhausted force, and in mid-October, on the 14th, the two armies meet near Hastings, on the ridge that later generations would remember as Senlac Hill. The battle itself is famous,
are here, sire.
but it's also
Thousands
easy to
strong.
misunderstand
We must
because
ride
it gets
south
retold
immediately.
like a
Yes.
legend.
What we have are sources that don't always agree. Norman narratives, later English traditions, and evidence that has to be interpreted carefully. But the broad shape of the day is solid enough. It's a long, hard fight. English infantry holds a defensive line, relying on the strength of a shield wall and the discipline of men who know that if they break, they die. Norman forces bring archers, infantry, and cavalry, tools that give them options and allow pressure to be applied in different ways over time. Hours pass, attacks come and go, lines bend and tighten, men get tired, and once exhaustion takes over, small mistakes become fatal. This is where modern viewers often want a clean explanation, a single trick, a single moment, a single decisive move that turns the whole battle. But medieval battles rarely work that way. They are messy, they are cumulative. A battle like Hastings is shaped by fatigue, morale, terrain, leadership, and luck, all interacting in ways that the men living through it can barely control. By the end of the day, Harold Godwinson is dead, and the English defense collapses. It's hard to overstate what that means. A king dying in battle is not simply the loss of a commander, it's the loss of a political center. It throws succession into confusion again. It forces the kingdom to make choices quickly, and quick choices usually benefit the side that is still organized. William doesn't instantly own England because he wins at Hastings. He has to take it, step by step, with a mixture of force, negotiation, and intimidation. Resistance continues, especially in the north. There are uprisings, local defiance, shifting loyalties.
Proceed as planned.
William responds in ways that
swift
range from pragmatic
and
to
decisive.
brutal, depending on what he thinks the moment requires. And the landscape begins to change. Fortifications rise, first simple and fast, then more permanent. Castles become a new kind of punctuation across England. They aren't just military structures, they are statements. They say, we are here, and we intend to remain.
Landed at Pevensey.
The English
They are
elite
burning
is
the
reshaped
towns.
as well. Some families lose land and power. New men arrive with new loyalties, new languages, and new networks that tie England more tightly to the continent than it has been in generations. This is why the year 1066 feels like a hinge in history, not because everything changes overnight, but because the direction changes, the center of gravity shifts. People often say that Harold Hardrada, dying at Stamford Bridge, marks the end of the Viking Age. That's true in a symbolic sense, but it's not a magical ending. Scandinavians do not vanish. Trade continues. Kings continue. Norse culture continues to evolve and influence Europe. What fades is the older world where a Scandinavian war king can plausibly seize England through one great expedition and then sail home with the future in his hands. In England, the story of the warrior is slowly being caged inside systems, fortified power, written administration, permanent occupation. The age of raids gives way to the age of rule. And when I look at these three men, Edward, William, and Harold, what I see isn't myth. I see pressure. I see ambition. I see fear. I see decision-making under conditions that would break most people.
Guide our
Edward
blades.
leaves uncertainty.
Grant us strength
William
in the
turns that
coming fight.
uncertainty into a plan. Harold tries to defend his kingdom against two storms and is crushed between them. That isn't a moral lesson exactly. It's simply what the sources show us if we read them without romance. The saddest part, maybe, is that none of them lived in a world where stepping back was easy. They didn't have the luxury of retirement. They didn't have the luxury of being wrong. Their choice...
Keep the line straight, men. Stay ready. For God and ever for Normandy. For glory! Hold the line! Stand fast! Push forward! Push forward! For the king! Charge! Shields up! Spears forward! Hold! Push! Push! For Normandy! Hold the line! Stand firm! Close ranks! Hold the line! Move up! Hold the line! Hold it! The perimeter must be secured by dawn. Yes, my lord, the men are already moving. And the wounded?
Pull the slack.
Steady, steady. Hold it there.